Hello and welcome to my channel Passionate PT. Today we're going to discuss about anterior cord syndrome. Now let's start. Anterior cord syndrome, as the name suggests, it is a collection of signs and symptoms that results from the damage to the anterior part of the spinal cord. Now, how this happen and what is the mechanism of injury? Let's discuss about that. It is a flexion injury, that means, and mostly occurs in the cervical spine. When there is sudden flexion, as in the case of accident, as in the case of whiplash injuries of the cervical spine, that results in the damage to the anterior part of the spinal cord and results in this syndrome. Now let's discuss in a bit detail that how does a sudden flexion of the cervical spine affects the anterior part of the spinal cord. Here I've made a random figure. As you can see, these are the vertebra. Between the vertebrae are the discs present. When the vertebra or the spine suddenly flexes, so vertebra suddenly flexes or they compress the anterior part of the disc present between them. Okay, compression of the anterior part of the disc results in protrusion of the posterior part of the disc. Okay, vertebra flexes, compress the anterior part. Because of the increased pressure on the anterior part, the posterior part protrudes backward like a bubble, you may say, or a balloon. If you compress it from the one side, it protrudes from the other side. Similarly, when the discs are compressed anteriorly by the sudden flexion of the vertebra, the posterior side of the disc protrudes backward, and as the spinal cord is located behind the vertebra, it passes through the foramens that are behind the vertebra. This anterior part of the spinal cord gets compressed or damaged, okay, and results in this syndrome. This syndrome, anterior cord syndrome, happens only in the cervical spine and almost occurs never in the thoracic or the lumbar spine. Why not? Because in the lumbar spine, why this doesn't occur in the lumbar spine? Because the spinal cord ends at the level of L1. Okay, when it ends at the level of L1, so in the lumbar spine almost no spinal cord is available to be affected by this injury, and in the thoracic spine there is very less range of motion that is available to affect. First, secondly, thoracic spine is very much stable by the presence of the ribs, so this also does not occur in the thoracic spine. So this injury is mainly related to the cervical spine. Now, as the injury affects the anterior part of the syndrome or anterior part of the spinal cord, so all the structures that are present anteriorly will be affected most. Now, which structures are present or which tracts are present anteriorly? So mainly on the anterior side are present corticospinal tracts and anterolateral spinothalamic tract. As you also know, corticospinal are also divided into two components, anterior and lateral, and similarly the spinothalamic tracts are also present anteriorly and laterally, so these tracts will be most affected. Damage to the corticospinal tracts will results in the paralysis if the damage is very extensive or massive, and if the effect is not that big, then that may result into the weakness of the muscles, as these are the motor tracts. Similarly, damage or injury to the anterolateral spinothalamic tract will result in the loss of sense of pain and temperature and other tickle it sexual sensations which these tract carries will also be affected. So mainly these two types of tracts will be affected. Now dorsal column medial lemniscal system will not be affected, as these tracts are located dorsally, more on the dorsal side or the posterior side of the spinal cord. Okay, so they are far from the anterior side and damage is to the anterior side, so dorsal column medial lemniscal system will be fine. And because DCML being intact, the sense of proprioception, vibration, 2-point discrimination, stereognosis, barognosis, all the sensations which are carried by DCML will be fine. Okay, so this is all about the anterior cord syndrome. Now let's discuss about the central cord syndrome. I have actually made it on the next page. Here it is. Now we will discuss the central cord syndrome. Again, you can see from it the name central cord syndrome that it affects the injury. In this, the injury affects the central part of the spinal cord. Here I'm mainly talking about the traumatic injury. There can be other systemic injuries, or like there can be tumor or any other disease that mainly affects the central part of the spinal cord. That can also result in this syndrome. So I'm mainly talking about the traumatic injury here. So contrary to the anterior cord syndrome, central cord syndrome happens mainly due to hyperextension injury of the cervical spine. Okay, hyperextension injury of the cervical spine will result in this, will affect the central part of the spinal cord. Okay, now this syndrome also mainly occurs in the cervical spine and does not occur in the thoracic and lumbar spine because of the same reasons which I have mentioned in the anterior cord syndrome. Okay, now central cord means it will affect the structures present in the center of the spinal cord. Okay, and which structures are mainly present into the center? Again, in the center, anterior, they're present corticospinal and anterolateral spinothalamic tracts. So again, corticospinal resulting in weakness or paralysis, and anterolateral spinothalamic tract resulting in loss of sense of pain and temperature will be mainly affected. And similar to the anterior cord syndrome, DCML tracts will not be affected. Dorsal column medial lemniscal system tracts will not be affected. Now here another thing which is very important to understand, that in central cord syndrome, upper extremity is more affected than the lower extremity. Okay, so here we need to understand why so. Because now okay, I'll explain you here in the figure I have made here again to make you people understand that why upper extremity is more affected, or there is more weakness in the upper extremity than the lower extremity. Here I'm not saying that the lower extremity will be completely spared, or there'll be no effects in the there'll be no effect on the lower extremity. Lower extremity may be or may not be affected, but upper extremity will be more affected than the lower extremity. So how that happens? As you can see, this is a figure I've shown. These are the corticospinal tracts which I have made. They're coming from the cortex towards the anterior horn cells, and they made in the black dots. The corticospinal tracts for the upper extremity, when they come from the cervical spine, corticospinal tracts coming from the cortex, they are located more medially, or in other words you can say centrally. As we move laterally, there are corticospinal tracts coming for the lower extremity or towards the lumbar region. As we move lower, the corticospinal tracts are present more laterally. So the corticospinal tracts for the upper extremity are located more medially or centrally than the tracts for the lower extremity. Similarly, anterolateral spinothalamic tract, when they enter and cross to ascend to the cross to the other side to ascend towards the brain. Same is the case with them. The anterolateral spinothalamic tract for the lower extremity enters, cross to the opposite side, and are present more laterally to move towards the brain. They cross, and then as the tracts as the tracts from the upper extremity enters, they enter and cross to the opposite side and are present more medially to move towards the brain. So the anterolateral spinothalamic tract for the upper extremity and the corticospinal tracts for the upper extremity both are located more centrally and medially as compared for the lower extremity. So as this is a central cord syndrome, so this will affect central part more, and in central part both the tracts for the upper extremity are present, so upper extremity will be more affected. Okay, so this will result in the central cord syndrome. Okay, hope you like the video. Thank you very much.